because you saw every night on TV people crossing the Rio Grande, coming to this country and violating our laws as they entered. We all know that if you're going to be a sovereign nation, you got to control your borders. We can't have millions of people coming here in violation of our laws, people that are on the terrorist watch list, people with criminal records, everybody just willy-nilly coming here. We are that land of opportunity, but also a land of the rule of law. We're seeing deportations going on now with priority on people that are criminals or on the terrorist watch list. We're hearing some economists and some business people saying our economy is in jeopardy if we deport these people, but no employer is going to hire somebody on the terrorist watch list if they know that they are. No employer is going to hire somebody with a criminal record if they know about that criminal record. So let's talk about the impact of deportation on the economy after people with criminal records, after people that are on the terrorist watch list, and the 1 2/10 or 1 3/10 million people that have been adjudicated that they did not meet the test of our law, that they could legally be in this country. And to have those 3 categories of people deported, then maybe let's talk about the impact on the economy after that. But I think that's quite a few months down the road. One other reason that I'm voting for Governor Noem, and this is a repeat of what I said last night on the floor of the United States Senate in regard to Pete Sethler being chairman or being Secretary of Defense. When these people that are nominees come to my office, I point out to them a couple things. Number one, I always say you're going to be asked if you'll answer our letters. And everybody for decades have been saying yes to that. And I point out to them how they ought to really say maybe, because I use the last 4 years of the Garland Department of Justice as an example, showing these nominees when they come to my office of a file of about 158 letters that the Department of Justice and the FBI haven't appropriately answered, even after they said they'd answer all of our letters. Now, that may be a tongue-in-cheek maybe, quote unquote, maybe, when I tell them that, but I think we have a responsibility to make sure that in our constitutional job of oversight to see that the laws are faithfully executed, that we, when we contact the administration, we think things are wrong, that we're entitled to an answer. This isn't a problem just in a Democrat administration. This is a problem in Republican administrations. So I asked the new Secretary of Defense that issue. He said he was going to be diligent about that. And I discussed the same thing with Governor Noem as well, because we ought to have our cooperation of the executive branch of government in Congress doing its job of oversight. I'm satisfied that Governor Noem will, to the best of her ability, help us with our oversight responsibilities and even help us get answers to those left over from the Biden administration. I think Governor Noem is very well qualified to be Secretary of Homeland Security. I wish her well in the enforcement of law and re-emphasize that border security is very important, not only for the sovereignty of this great nation of ours, because you can't be a sovereign nation if you don't control the borders, and secondly, for our national security, because you can't have people on the terrorist watch list coming to this country and invading us, and also for law enforcement, because you can't have people with criminal record coming to this country. It's a big job that's left over from the last 4 years of a Secretary of Homeland Security that wasn't enforcing the law. I think Governor Noem is up to the test, and we wish her well as she proceeds down this road of making sure that the sovereignty of the United States is protected and our national security is protected, and we have a safe nation based upon law enforcement being able to do its job. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Idaho.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, in about an hour or so, we are going to vote on the nomination, or at least on cloture on the nomination for Scott Bessent to be the Treasury Secretary of the United States. And I rise today to urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this motion. A Treasury Secretary heads the agency charged with supporting economic growth, representing U.S. interests before foreign nations and global financial markets and organizations, managing the federal treasury, and overseeing financial institutions, to name just a few of those important responsibilities. Past successful Treasury secretaries have understood business and financial markets, as well as foreign policy, national security, budgets, and regulation. Mr. Bessent's impressive background positions him for similar success. He has worked for the last 3 decades as one of the sharpest minds in the global financial industry. He has decades of academic, professional, and leadership experience relevant to these positions. When it comes to Mr. Bessent's qualifications, there is no room for debate. His background and training are tailor-made for this role, and he has the demeanor and character to be an effective secretary. His powerful presentation at his hearing about his desire to serve in government in order to make a meaningful difference was impressive to all. It includes restoring prosperity and opportunity that our nation experienced during President Trump's first term in office. As Mr. Bessent stated, accomplishing key tasks like extending vital tax cuts for all Americans is literally a pass-fail exercise. And I look forward to working closely with him to ensure that we succeed. I strongly agree with a sentiment that my colleague Senator Graham shared at the nomination hearing, that if qualifications, and I might add character, are one's test, voting to confirm Mr. Bessent is one of the easiest we could ever take. In prior Congresses, I've joined with many of my Republican colleagues in voting for well-qualified Treasury Secretary candidates put forward by a Democrat president, even though I didn't agree with all of the positions they advocated. Mr. Bessent's candidacy ought to enjoy similar support, and I encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join with me in advancing his nomination. He is the right person for this job, and I commend President Trump in making such an excellent selection. Mr. President, I yield the floor. The absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alston Brooks. Mr. President,
The senator from South Dakota.
I would move to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection. Under the previous order, all post-cloture time has expired. The question is on the nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders,
Oh, that's where I live. Signature.
Mr. Schatz,
Yeah, okay, yeah,
Mr. Schiff,
yeah. No, signature, I love signature.
Mr. Schmidt,
Yeah, yeah, I can walk to it from my house. They have great, you know they want to regional autonomy 3 years ago.
Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen,
Yeah,
Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune,
yeah,
Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Budd, Cornyn, Crapo, Daines, Graham, Hassan, Hyde-Smith, Johnson, Kane, Kim, Lee, Lummis, Marshall, McConnell, McCormick, Moody, Moreno, Mullen, Paul, Peters, Rounds, Scott of Florida, Tillis. Senators voting in the negative: also Brooks, Duckworth, Gillibrand, Klobuchar, Lujan, Murray, Padilla, Reed, Sanders. Mr. Schumer? No. Mr. Hickenlooper? No. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Ms. Rosen, no. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Warner, no.
You should go. Because they were the, all the.
Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Fetterman, aye. Mr. Durbin, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Justice, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Slotkin, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Cassidy, aye. Mr. Young, aye.
Just none. Okay. I'm just asking. I just have to reconsider it. Get to the next vote. You catching? You need to start.
The yeas are 59. The nays are 34. The nomination is confirmed.